Hi, and welcome to our Consent and Safety Mechanics in Horror Games panel. Today I am joined by a bunch of excellent human beings to discuss this topic. I, again, am Danielle Lauzon. I'm going to be the host today. I'm pretty sure, is this one of the panels? Man, in my ear. So we're going to be talking about consent and safety mechanics. It's there. If you have questions, go ahead and throw them in there. We'll try to get to them, but we've got a bunch of topics we're going to talk about specifically. And I'm going to go around and have everybody introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Steffie.
Hi, so I'm Steffie. I'm a writer and a developer of games. I do a bunch for Onyx Path Publishing. I write indie games that you can get on my Patreon, which is Liz and Steffie. I just developed the Legend Lore fantasy game for Onyx Path, which is currently on Kickstarter, and it has a free preview manuscript link somewhere in the Kickstarter. So definitely check that out if you like 5th edition, because you'll love this game. And yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Excellent. Kienna?
Hi, yeah, I'm Kienna Shaw, also known as Kienna S on the internet. I use she, they pronouns. I am a TTRPG creator and streamer, and I'm also the co-creator of the TTRPG Safety Toolkit, which is a resource that helps compile safety and support tools across the community into one comprehensive, encompassing place for people to learn more about safety tools and how to implement them at their tables.
All right, Corrine.
Hi, I'm Corrine, otherwise known as Manic Pixie Girl on Twitter. I run games on Onyx Path's channel, such as Scarredlands Purge of the Serpent Holds, and a new Legend Lore game that's going this month on Tuesdays. And it's a lot of fun. But yeah, basically I am a GM and DM who likes to do horror and spooky stuff, but safely.
And then Jacqueline.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline, otherwise known as Jax. You can find me around the internet as Rufflejax. I'm very chatty. I also wrote on Changeling the Lost 2nd edition, which was one of my dream projects. I wrote the playing considerately. I'm sorry, advice for considerate play. It's the morning. I'm playing. It's not even the morning anymore. This is a terrible part. I'm playing. I wrote advice for considerate play for Vampire the Requiem 5th edition. And I've done a lot of work with safety tools and care work in horror gaming, so I'm very excited to be here.
Excellent. So we're going to start this panel off talking about what we mean by safety. So I'm going to kind of open the floor to talk about when we say the word safety in mechanics and stuff like that, what are we talking about?
I would say, yeah, Jax, go.
No, you go first. You started.
I would say it's specifically player safety. It means that you come up with a system of either rules or ways to signal or agreements, but we'll talk about how you do it. But the purpose of it to me is to make sure that you can throw the characters in all sorts of absolutely terrifying circumstances while the players at the table feel safe. And therefore remain willing and enthusiastic about all the horrors you're throwing at the main character.
Jax?
I mean, to me, safety is just another set of techniques you can use to enhance your game. It's a way of making informed consent part of the game so that when you ask your players, hey, can I throw X at you? And they say, yes, I am comfortable with that. And then you can really go deep and go into the weird, like, squamous beating heart of whatever particular horror you're dealing with and really enjoy that journey together instead of everybody having an awkward sort of get me out of here time.
Right. Okay. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that when you're talking about safety in tabletop, you're kind of specifically talking about the fact that roleplay in particular is a really personal thing for people. And it's something that you kind of dive into more than a lot of other types of games. Like you're playing a video game, you generally don't feel like it's you. You do get that thrill, but it's a little bit different because it's not you making those exact choices. It's not you sitting in that room. And once you are in that position yourself, it's I think, a little bit easier to get wrapped up in the moment. And so you use the safety tools to make sure that everybody's still enjoying themselves, everybody agrees to what's going on, because it's hard to get out of that moment. So.
Okay. So I want to kind of talk about, Steffi mentioned that we're really talking about the players, being able to have a good time while their characters are not having a good time. And, and, but we talk about that, in general terms, basically, but why is this such an important thing?
I'd really like to hear from Kienna on this because of
yes.
Yeah, so generally speaking, and trying to make sure that safety is honored, is being able to say that the players and the people that you're playing with are above everything else that happens at the table. It is what I call the principle of care, in which you care for the people, for who they are, for their complex emotions, for their feelings, for their worth as a person, over top whatever story or gotcha moment or whatever else you are trying to implement there. And that goes for everybody who's participating in this shared experience of imagination and role playing together. And so by being able to formalize them into a system where even if you can't verbally talk about your feelings, you have a way to invoke ways to make yourself feel safe or make other people feel safe is something that's really important to set out, because you can always say, oh, but just talk to each other, but talking to each other is a lot harder than most people would expect it to. There's a lot of social pressures. We try to avoid conflicts and pushing against the status quo, which is we just made this happen in canon, quote unquote, and I don't want to push back on that, is a huge obstacle. And there are many, many reasons why someone might not want to honestly talk about quite honestly, a very difficult subject. And so by making sure that safety tools are normalized and used not just for the worst case scenarios, but also even the minor things, like, oh, hey, that NPC had the same name as my brother. I'd rather that NPC not have the same name as my brother. That's not cool with me. There's so many ways that it can be used to help form a shared experience that is improved for everybody, and making it a normal part of our process, so that we always emphasize, hey, we're putting everyone and their fun and enjoyment and comfort first.
Excellent. I feel like that was really comprehensive. So,
Yeah.
So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about safety mechanics and we talk about all this kind of stuff, one of the, part of the description of this is consent. And I feel like, at least personally, I think consent and when we engage consent and what that means, and we'll talk about that, is one of the most important aspects of safety is garnering consent or revoking consent. So let's talk about what we mean about like, what do we mean by consent in the first place? What do you mean by consent? Let's start with that.
I saw Jax putting up a hand.
Yes, Jax.
I like doing my little hand thing because I don't like running over people in panels. But so I got really into safety tools. This is going to be a little bit of a journey, so come with me on it. I got into safety tools when I noticed that my friends personally, who are older gamers, treat gaming like a second job, right? Like if you don't show up at game on time, if you don't go along with the group, you might be fired from your game. I've seen people call their GMs abusive partners because their GMs kept doing this thing where they would put plots on people that they didn't want, but they had to go along with it because it was their GM and they didn't want to be mean to their friend, right? So you get stuck in this very weird situation of people just assuming that the game has this control over your life, that you have this obligation. And for me, that's very awkward. I don't like playing in games that have that level of obligation. I don't like engaging with fun that has that level of obligation, right? So for me, consent is being able to say, this is the amount of my person that I want to be able to put into this game. This is the amount of, maybe I want to have this game be super relaxed and not very introspective, or maybe I want this game to be super introspective, but also I need to have the time be flexible. Consent is just being able to go, here's what I am able to put into this game, and here's what I want to get out of this game. Right? Like with any social interaction, honestly. And I don't think that's something we talk about enough as people, is that any social interaction has given norms of consent. Mm-hmm. So if anybody wants to build on that, that's sort of how I got very into safety and consent tools, and where I establish my version of consent.
Steffie?
So what I would like to talk about is something that happened in the game without my consent. If anybody doesn't like the story, put up your hand and I'll stop. So my character was a reformed soldier from an enemy, from like really tyrant bad people. And I had joined the rebels to fight my former faction. And there was another player who was playing a traumatized soldier of the rebels. And he thought I was a spy and I was still with them. And I thought, going in, that this would be an interesting, weird social distrust dynamic between the two of us. What he did, at one point, my character got knocked unconscious, and I wake up and he has me tied to a chair. And he cuts off my hand because I killed people with that hand. And he didn't tell me he was going to do that. At no point did the storyteller go, Steffie, are you comfortable with this? I was unconscious and I wake up, tied to a chair, and he tortures me and he cuts off my hand. That was the last game I played with either of them. It's like, yeah. But at that point, I didn't even have the language for it. I was just completely shocked. I just sat there at the table going, what the fuck?
What just happened?
Yeah. What just happened?
Yeah.
And the thing is, if those people would have cared about consent, they would have stopped the game and they said, Steffie, this is what my character would do to your character. How do you feel? And I would have been like, hell no. Or we would have worked out something else, like maybe I didn't tie you up properly and you escaped. Maybe one of the other characters at the table could have stepped in and gone, what the hell are you doing? But no, he just said, this is what I do. And the storyteller went, well, she's unconscious and tied to a chair, so it's not like you can stop her. So yeah, that happens. And it was such a shock. And that was the last time I ever played with anyone of that group, because I was just horrified that the player would do it. I was horrified that the storyteller would just let it happen. I was horrified that none of the other players at the table would go, yeah, I'm going to randomly walk in at this moment and go, what is this? They were just all okay with it, because my character had no agency. And they translated that to, I had no agency.
Right.
And that was just terrible. And what safety mechanics do is they create a system where your character might not have agency, but you as players still do. And people talk to you before they do shit like this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that actually kind of brings me to the concept of informed consent, which is, I think, what you bring home, Steffie, of, I will define informed consent as essentially you must know what's about to happen to be able to consent to it. And so before a game or even before an action is taken, you must inform somebody before they can consent to it. So, there's other types of consent as well, such as implicit consent versus explicit consent. So does anybody want to kind of talk about the different kinds of consent that players can have at a table and when to use one versus the other? Kienna?
Yeah, sure. So let's go through them first. We already talked about what informed consent is, which is you have all the information ahead of time and you consent or not consent based on that information of what's going to happen. And then there's explicit versus implicit consent. So explicit means that I say out loud or on paper or otherwise said pretty otherwise expressed outwardly that I am okay with what's going on. And so that's saying I can verbally say, yes, I consent to what's going on. I'm cool with it. Or vice versa. I can say, hey, I'm not cool with this. Can we go back? Implied consent is the if I don't say anything, then we go with what is the status quo. And most of the times in gaming, that status quo is I am okay with what's going on. So if you don't express otherwise, it's saying that you are okay with what's happening. As for when to use all of those, really depends on your system and your support and safety system and how you do that. For myself, I almost always advocate for trying to do as explicit as possible because you don't know what people are going through when they're being quiet. Because being quiet can either mean, yeah, I'm cool, I'm sitting back, I'm letting things happen, or I'm having a shock response to what's going on. And so it's very easy to misinterpret implied consent. And so you have to really find ways to adjust those. So perhaps using things, I'm just going to pull off the X and O cards as a good kind of usage of that. So the X and O cards are essentially a way to check in during the game. Each of those symbols represent a different way of how okay you are with things that's going on. X being, nope, not okay with this. Can we go back and retcon or just change that? And being, we're kind of getting to a point that I don't want to be at. Can we either slow down or skip the scene or otherwise, deal with that? And O being, I'm okay. I may look like I'm freaking out. I may look like I'm crying. I'm angry. I'm whatever, but I'm actually good with what's going on. Keep going. Keep hurting me. And so these are explicit so these are interesting in the way that they work with both explicit and implied consent, because it implies that if you don't use an X or N card, that you're okay with what's going on. But by using the O card and being explicit about your consent about it, you are reassuring that there is that consent and that information going forward. Which happens a lot in horror games specifically, where someone may be role playing a very intense moment, and I may be like, I don't know if you're cool with this, and I'll throw up an O question mark. Hey, are you okay? And they're like, yes, I'm stopping right now. I'm having a moment, but please keep going with this. I'm like, cool, let's keep going. And so it's all about trying to find the moments of asking for explicit informed consent. So me again doing that check-in of question mark. Hey, are you okay? And having everyone go like, yep, I'm cool. Or they go, actually I'm glad you asked. Can you put this is actually an X for me? Can we go back and do that? So
I'm a huge fan of the explicit consent because, like my story, but almost every story I've heard from people who've been in a situation like that, it has consistently been like, I was so shocked. I couldn't have put forward that X card even if I couldn't have moved. I couldn't have said anything. I couldn't have pulled forward the X card. So what you definitely need is that explicit consent the consent system where people ask like, are you okay? And then that asking probably breaks the scene a bit. And then you can say like, no, I'm not. Yeah, because that freeze reaction has been pretty universal in every story I've heard of somebody going, that wasn't cool. And they all say, I just froze.
Well, yeah. A lot of times the way your fight, flight, freeze reactions work is your freeze reaction is maybe if I just sit here, it will stop, right? And it's just easier to do that when you're doing pretendy fun time stuff. And it's just easier to go, okay, if I don't say anything, it will end, and then I don't have to do anything about it. So being able to sort of subvert that freeze reaction with safety tools is very helpful.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say that one thing that I think is important to know as someone who is running a game, particularly if you're someone who's running a game that's streamed, is that the players are not going to want to, oftentimes they're not going to want to break that scene. They're putting on a show, and that makes it incredibly, like, even more important to check in with your players and make sure they have the chance for that explicit consent, because you know, whether you're doing that with in the moment things, you know, seeing that your players could be upset, or knowing that this is a sensitive subject, or even beforehand in the game, you know, knowing that you've written something that could be, you know, sensitive to people, and just approaching your players beforehand. I actually did that this weekend with my players, because I knew that there was a really heavy scene coming up, and I wanted to make sure that specific things that I was going to say were approved before I said them. And I let my players make changes, give me the explicit go-ahead to say these things I was going to say, because I didn't want to hurt them. It was only their character that was in that moment, not them. So.
You know, one of the critiques that I hear a lot is how do I keep things suspenseful? How do I surprise my character, my players, with a suspenseful moment if I have to, like you said, Corrine, talk to them before the game starts about a tricky subject that I want to utilize? So how do you address that kind of question, Jax?
So this is my favorite question, because people are always surprised by the answer. So surprise and suspense are two different things. Surprise is when you don't realize there's a bomb under the table until 10 seconds before it goes off. Suspense is where the audience knows there's a bomb under the table, but the characters don't. So being able to tell your players, hey, there's this metaphorical bomb under the table, and letting them play out the scene with the out-of-character knowledge that it's there, but the in-character knowledge that it's not, and letting them make those choices to deal with that suspense is, for me, super fun. And I think it really improves the quality of the gameplay, knowing that there's going to be horrific moments, knowing that things are going to sort of collapse into this terrifying scene, and building towards that. I think one of my favorite recent examples was in the Technocracy Reloaded actual play that we did right here on the Onyx Path stream. Travis and I knew that my character, who was a member of the New World Order, had been brainwashed by the Technocracy to see if they could train her out of being a Nefandi, because she was born with a Nefandic avatar. And that was something that was communicated to me and several other players during the course of this. So seeing how everything was sort of leading up for my character to that struggle of having to decide whether she was going to give in to her avatar to save her friends, or try to cut out her own avatar and also save her friends, was really hugely impactful for me. And I had a lot of talks with Travis during this, and he's like, I don't really want to spoil the campaign for you. And I'm like, look, it's better play for me if you tell me what direction you're going to go in, because then we can really just hit full throttle and just go into it. So for me, it's kind of more like instead of hogging all of the blocks for yourself, handing some of the blocks to your players and being like, okay, so what are we going to do with this? What are we going to build with this? And then going from there.
Right. Corrine, you look like you wanted to add something.
I do. It was basically that thing that Jax just said. The idea that when you are working in tandem with the person leading the game, like as a player, and when the person leading the game is working with you, you create better stories and better moments than if you were just telling that story yourself. Role-playing is a community building sort of game. You are playing together, you're building the story together. And the more blocks, in this case, that you hand your players, the better moments are going to come out of it. So you can still have suspense, you can still have shocking moments, even if your players know the things that are going to happen. It doesn't take away the surprise. It just makes it surprise that everybody's cool with, instead of, oh, we're not having a good time anymore, which is never a good sign.
Yeah, and it's not a very nice thing to say, but it's the true thing to say. If you can't surprise your players or do something interesting without relying on bigotry and hurting your players, you're not creative. You're not a good TM player.
It's just shock value at that point. You're just shocking people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you take anything away from this panel, please take that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, right. There's a huge difference between surprise, suspense, and shock. And usually the last thing you want to try to go for is shock. Like saying things just to shock people is not actually like good. Like that's the asshole like who does that. So like don't be the asshole.
Yeah.
Something that somebody brought up and I think is important, and some people are talking about it in the chat right now, is when you did give consent, right? When we talked about it beforehand and I thought, yeah, I'm going to be okay with whatever it is we talked about. And then in the moment I realized, like, you know what, I'm not okay with this, but I don't, because I gave the consent, because I've already said yes. How do I and I don't want to say no now. How do you gauge that kind of thing? Because in general, and this is, I think, really hard for people, because in general, if you're a person who, I brought this to you, I wanted your input, you said yes, I'm moving forward, I'm maybe not going to think to ask you halfway through if you're still okay with it.
Yeah.
So, and you may be like, well, I said yes already, so now I can't say no. So how do we enable people to say no in the middle after they've already said yes? Jax.
So this is a weird cultural thing. For the West, and I'm sure I'm just speaking as my experiences as a white American. We don't really have a culture of being able to revoke consent, right? It's not just a gaming thing is the issue. Is we have this whole thing of, well, if you say no once you said yes, then you were leading me on, or you were fucking with me, or whatever. And yes, it can words. I'm a writer. It can hurt to hear I changed my mind, right?
Absolutely.
Because then you're worried that you hurt someone or that you did something wrong. And this is something that comes up in a lot of the trauma reading that I do, not even just gaming. Is this idea that we need to learn to hear actually no without taking it personally, and that can be hard. Because it can feel like we were lied to, or it can feel like somebody was manipulating us or dicking us over, and 99% of the time that's not what's happening. But learning to hear actually no, I'm not okay with this in gaming is a valuable skill, because then we can learn to hear it in other parts of our life as well.
Steffie?
Yeah, I think what Jack said about the cultural thing, I think that even goes as far as the whole concept of a promise given is a promise kept. No, you can change your mind. You can make a promise under duress and not keep it. Like Belle, if somebody forces you to stay in some weird random castle or he'll kill your dad, it's okay to lie. And it's okay to, like they said on Picard, a promise is not a prison. And the same goes for consent. Consent is not a prison. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to go back on your promise. It's okay to change consent. It's okay to go halfway through no. But yeah, it's this whole cultural implication that once you've given your word, once you've agreed, you cannot ever change your mind, ever. And that's just weird. It's really, really weird. And it teaches an entire generation of people to be in bad places. But we're not discussing the culture, we're discussing the game. But yeah, so I think it's hugely important in role-playing games to create a culture where we're all you can absolutely retract your consent whenever you want, whenever you go I'm terrified of sharks. It's one of the few things I tell all of my storytellers. But there are moments when I feel braver than I usually do, and I might be like, yeah, okay, sharks, that's fine. Don't have them attack me, but you can have them in the water. It's fine. But then when we're in the game, if I'm no longer feeling that brave, I might just go no. Second thought, I know I said yes. I know I said yes an hour ago, but we're here now, and no. no, like make it a kraken. And we need to have that discussion out of game so that we can have it during the game, so that we create an environment where everybody knows that you can change your mind halfway through. It's fine.
Yes. Thinking on that topic, and, I think this is a really complicated and complex issue that there is no right answer for, because there are so many, like you say, cultural blocks to saying, to withdrawing your consent in the first place, and to dealing with somebody said no after they said yes, whenever it happens to you. And, I think as a person facilitating a game, having, consent sheets that have a spectrum of I'm mostly always okay with this, it's probably never going to bother me, I'm only kind of okay with this, maybe talk to me before, and then no, never include this. And all of the things that are, I might be okay with this, but you need to talk to me before, need to be, while we're in the middle of it, I also need to check up with you, even if you said yes. We need to treat those as, maybe I didn't even talk to you in the middle of it. And so that we can understand that just because you said yes to something that you were iffy about doesn't mean you're always going to keep saying yes to it. And that's something I need to check in on this. And even the green things that you're like, burning down villages is never going to bother me until the one time it does. So, making sure that we're always checking in, and anything that could feel a little iffy is all in my opinion, maybe a way to kind of help facilitate that. Corrine.
And I was just going to say, I think this was mentioned earlier, that especially checking in with green things is a great idea, because people's scenarios change, especially if you're doing a campaign. You don't know necessarily what's happening to this person this week or last week. Maybe they were fine with, pets being in danger, for instance, but their best friend, their dog, just passed. And the idea of that is horrifying at this moment. It will cause them to break it down into tears. And I think that's something that is important to keep in mind, that you don't know everything that's going on in your players' lives, and even something they thought would never bother them could change just depending on the scenario at home. And it's hard to, if they don't know that they can speak up about it, you have to be able to speak up for them and be like, is everybody okay with this? Even if it breaks the moment, it's okay. You can get back into the moment. It's more important that everybody's having a good time than, breaking that moment at that moment.
Right. Kienna.
Yeah, for sure. Jumping off of what Corrine just said on two different pathways. One, this is even more important. Like, we always think of safety tools and supports things and consent with newer groups or people that you've never played with before. But these are so important with groups that you have played with for several years as well, because you end up creating a culture of status quo where, everything is this. You want to maintain the same environment all the time. And so when things change, it's actually sometimes even harder to bring up that thing has changed for you because you're like, oh, wow, it's been like many years that I've been totally okay with this, and suddenly I'm not. But it's something that I think a lot of people in groups that they've been with for a very long time seem to absolve themselves with this. Like, oh, I don't need to worry about this explicitly because, I'm friends with these people. We've been doing this for a while. But these are always things to keep in mind all the time. Just have to do that. And the other thing I want to also jump on is you can always, as you said, you can always break the moment and get back into it. There is a idea in gaming that the moment is sacred. Like, there's this thing, like, when you're into it, you can't do anything to break it. And that's bullshit. Bullshit. It is absolutely, it doesn't matter what's happening there, right? At its core, you are working as a group together in a played shared imagination story. Like, you are powerful enough people to bring this moment to life. Like, who's to say you can't do it again? Like, there's absolutely nothing stopping you from pausing, taking a break. Like, you can pause a movie and then come back to it and it's still just as tense. Like, that doesn't change anything. You can pause a video game and come back to it, it's still just as tense. And here you are with with other people with vivid imaginations like you, be able to create this space together. Shouldn't you be able to do that as well? Like, there's nothing sacred about that.
Right.
Yes.
Agreed.
Jax, I don't know if you wanted to add. You
No,
were very
I do.
excited.
That is one of my favorite points, and I'm really glad you brought it up, Kienna. The term I've been using, because I heard it from someone else and it just sticks with me, is immersion is a false god.
Yes.
Like, exactly what Kienna said. You can pause a movie, you can pause a video game, pause any other artistic medium and come back to it, and it's still going to be the same. You can do it with a tabletop. And I like the positivity that you put into it too, Kienna, because a lot of people get really angry about this and they're like, no, it's a false god and you should destroy the idea. But the idea of we were powerful enough to create this moment together, we can do it again. I really like that play on it. I think that's awesome. The other thing is with the whole experienced group, I saw someone in the chat saying, oh, what kind of safety tools should I use for my group? And unfortunately, we can't answer that without knowing your group, right? Like, different safety tools are going to work better for different people. And then, of course, you're always going to have those people, and I've LARPed with these people before, and it's a struggle, where they're going to be like, oh, well, I am experienced, so I don't need these tools because I know I'm responsible.
Right.
And it's something, like Kienna said, that we really need to work to change, because there's this idea that safety tools are only for people who don't know what they're doing. And no, they're for everyone. That's the point.
Yeah. Steffi, you.
Yeah, so tying into what Kienna and Jax said, it feels like very often still the social covenant of the game is that the game's purpose is to create immersion, to tell a story. And I think we should move to the social covenant of the game is that everybody at the table has a good time. And if we make that shift, then we create a culture where if we're role-playing together and I feel Jax going silent next to me, that I might go, hang on, Danielle, let me check with Jax to see if she's okay. And
Thank you, Steph.
because once we create that new social covenant, we also create the fact that we are all responsible for each other. So then it becomes everybody's task at the table to look to that one player who's suddenly going really quiet, or who's looking at her X card but not pushing it forward, because that then becomes everybody's job, and that means you're going to catch problems hopefully before they actually happen. That does mean that we need to change the social covenant of what the game is about.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So talking, we talked a lot about consent, and there's, a couple of questions that I think are pertinent to this that I'm going to go ahead and bring up now before we move on to horror specifically. And one of them is, if you're setting up a one shot with people you've never met before, how do you prep them for whatever you're about to do? And, I have answers for that, but, how would you handle that for, you're running a convention game, you've got a thing. How do you prep players for what you're about to do?
Yeah.
So my first very basic advice for a one shot with people you don't met is play it safe. I know that there are definitely always issues that you couldn't have foreseen, like weird things, like this girl is afraid of sharks, like wouldn't have seen that coming. That's fine, but there are a couple of things that almost everybody is going to object to, like bigotry and transphobia and racism and misogyny. Nobody likes that shit. So just keep it away from your table. And if you do put it at your table because you're running a social commentary game, then put that explicitly in the content notes for your game. So play it safe and put everything that you have any doubts about in your content notes. That's the basic. That's how you start.
Kienna.
I have about a year and a half experience running Bluebeard's Bride for Magpie Gaming at
Was just going to comment on that. Sorry.
Yeah, that was good. So I've been doing that for about a year and a half, which means playing with strangers with a game of feminine horror, which explicitly explores sexism, domestic abuse, potential sexual violence, and all that stuff. Thankfully, most people know what they're signing up for when they're signing up for a game like that. But also, I implement I always run through safety tools at the very beginning of a game, whichever ones I'm using. Normally, I use lines and veils, which are getting players to tell me what are their lines in content, aka please don't ever have this show up in no matter what, and veils being this can be mentioned but never explicitly shown otherwise. And I always demonstrate as a GM first as to what that is. And so, for example, I always put, my lines are going to be homophobia or going to be transphobia, are going to be, I usually also put sexual violence, even though it is a tenet of that game, in there, just because that's not something I'm comfortable with strangers working with. And then, my veils are eye trauma. I don't like eye injuries in great detail. And then I also use the X and an O cards. Actually, I have mine right here from the toolkit, which I am the first one to use them always. I say something, and then I X myself, and that gives that permission there. Right. But yeah, just being, obviously going off of what Steffie said, being super explicit about what that is and default to, don't include shit in there unless you absolutely have to. And if you absolutely have to, tell them ahead of time. And also explicitly stating that if they realize partway through or at the very beginning that suddenly they realize this game is not for them, give them permission to walk away. Give them permission to be like, you know what? I thought I'd be okay with this, but I'm not anymore. I'm gonna get up and go. And having that explicit open table and don't take it personally, because it's not you that they have a problem with. It's the content is not for them for that day. So being able to have that out in the open and that no judgment space is incredibly important.
All right, we're at about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to move on to speaking on horror specifically, and talking about like utilizing safety mechanics with horror to make that experience, in my opinion, better. So let's kind of talk a little bit about what horror is, just very briefly, and the kind of tropes that we're looking for when we talk about running a horror game. Corrine.
Okay.
Put you on the spot.
So I would say in the vein of like common horror tropes, you'd be talking about things like you have like the primal fears, the fear of darkness, the fear of other, the fear of, when you're being chased, like those kind of things are very much in there. But there's also body horror. There is the fear of the unknown in general. And those are going to be big ones in most horror games. You're going to find most things falling under those categories. And I would say that when you're dealing with consent and safety with those things, doing that first safety checklist is going to be really important. You want to know if any of your players are not cool with any of the themes in your game. You're going to tell them, this is going to deal with some body horror. This is going to deal with fear of the unknown. And not every game is for every player, and that's okay. It's the idea of having that open table where it's okay if this game isn't right for you, because if it's not right for you, maybe there's someone else it is right for, and everybody can enjoy themselves. But I think that's kind of the first step, is making sure that you set forth your themes and let everybody know so they can opt out if they have to.
Right. Jax, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add. Jax.
Can Jax hear
us? Yeah, I can hear you. My computer was frozen for a second. So I apologize. So somebody mentioned the horror contract in Cult, and while I did not work on that, it is actually something I edited. And it is it's sort of an abbreviated version of the consent checklist. It's the idea that we are all agreeing to abide by these lines, veils, etc. And it is something I really like. It did come from the Swedes, so I had to kind of fight them to keep that in there. Because they really they're like, yes, it will be very real and intense. And I have a running joke about working with Swedes, but no, I really like the horror contract in Cult. I think it's a great baseline. Something I am actually writing for one of the upcoming Cult books which is currently on Kickstarter, but I'm not going to advertise that here because this is Onyx PathCon. Is I wrote an essay called Bound, Caged, Abandoned. It's specifically different kinds of trauma, how to respectfully play them out, examples of using them in your game, and what's actually behind the trauma. Because I think a lot of people, when they play horror games, when they run people who have certain kinds of trauma, they tend to lean on the stereotypes, right? So the idea of someone going into a mental hospital is, oh, it's scary because everyone's crazy and it's terrible. When a lot of the actual trauma of being incarcerated in a mental institution is that you have some sort of, in a lot of ways, it's a lot of people with PTSD. So you have some trauma that you're trying to work out, and basically what you're being told is you can't interact with other people, you have to be in bed by a certain time, you can't turn off the lights, you can't have comfort objects, people are going to be touching you, people are going to be drugging you. It's a great way to get re-traumatized, right? And people don't really acknowledge that. So I wrote this essay in this book to sort of give people an idea of, here is the actual terror in these settings, and how you can use your game, how you can use your horror games to both be more respectful of the people at your table and use horror as sort of this cleansing, cathartic experience.
Sorry, that's my dog.
Yeah,
She's agreeing with you.
yeah. I'm gonna just really quickly interject. Not really, but so I think, you know, one of the tropes of horror that you just really described is the lack of agency, and that's, you know, one of the things we talked about with Steffie earlier is your characters can have lack of agency, and that's actually really terrifying. People don't like not having control of their own lives. That is 100% a thing that scares people. And so your character being in a situation where they don't have control over what's happening to them, but you as a player still has agency to act and decide how that's going to go out, can be really terrifying and have a thing. So, you know, one of the things that we talk about horror is that, you know, we're really pushing boundaries with horror, right? We're pushing on things that like trigger fear response and trigger, you know, these responses in our brain that are like, no, I don't like it. Do it more. Like, what is it about horror that we like? Why do we like that? Like, and how does safety make that easier to, you know, to get into the parts of that you like? It's Jax had her hand up.
So we're going to get a little NSFW here. I apologize. It hits the same bit of our brain that kink does. It's that rush of being able to engage with pain, with fear, with danger in a safe and controlled way. Because human brains love that shit. And to be able, as a trauma survivor, as myself, being able to play with traumatic danger, with loss of agency, with just spooky shit is really healing for me, because it's a way to say, here's what I deal with in my daily life. Now let's put it into a game, and then let's see how that will change if I change the way I'm engaging with it, or the world has a different way of engaging with it.
Right. Steffi, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so one thing for me is that I'm, all of you, where I'm a woman in a world that doesn't value women much, and I don't think it likes women much. And horror helps me to engage with a fear that I feel pretty much daily when I go outside in a way that is safe. And I think actually that whole idea of allowing you to interact with fears that you have that might actually be founded in a way that is safe, because it's a move that I can pause. It probably explains why the recent horror movies that we've seen, like The Babadook and Midsommar and Get Out, all deal with people who are in that situation. They're in a world that doesn't like them and doesn't value them. But this is now a safe way to explore that fear that most of us probably feel very frequently. And yeah, I think that helps, that idea of, you know, people are always asking, do you like being afraid? I like being afraid. I'm often afraid, and I like being afraid in a way that is safe.
Right. Corrine?
I would very much agree with that. I think it's the idea, and of both Jax and Steffi, that there's a part of humans that like to be scared in a way, because it gives you that fear response in a good way if you can control it. If you can step away and be like, oh, okay, I'm done now. I'm done with this adrenaline. I'm done with feeling that tense feeling. As long as you can walk away and be safe, it doesn't come with the negative aspects of it. But as soon as you can't walk away, then it makes it different. But I think that it's very much a case of, in a way, we like to be scared, but in a way that's safe.
Right. All the adrenaline, none of the pain.
Exactly.
We consent to being terrified by a horror movie, which is very cathartic if we often experience fear that we did not consent to.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, when we talk about doing it in a safe place, right, we know we can step away, we know this, that kind of drives home the point that making sure that the games are safe and that these safety mechanics are in place. I often say that, I feel more comfortable making things even more intense when the players are empowered to get up and walk away at any moment, because it means I can drive further into those fears and they're more likely to let me if they can, X and O it away or whatever. So, what about, I guess, kind of bring this all together, because we only have a few more minutes left to talk about how these two things intersect with, we enjoy feeling this fear, but we also, it's only good because we are safe.
I'd really like to hear from Kienna on this to start us off.
Yeah. So, essentially, what safety, consent, all of this can do is they provide you the guidelines for what's okay, what's not okay for your table and for your players, but then it also gives you so much freedom as to what's totally okay to delve very deep into. For example, again, pulling back to Bluebeard's Bride and all the games I've run there, I get, all the things of please let's not have sexual violence, not have homophobia, transphobia. Can we not have bees? Can we not have this stuff? I'm like, sure, okay. And now I'm going to go super hard on all the stuff that you gave me consent to go super hard on. So body horror shows up all the time, or extreme lack of agency, or any of these other things that I've been now given free permission to, because I'm no longer afraid of stepping on toes. Once I know that my players have the power to tell me no when they need to. Rather than always having to second guess myself or having to always check, be cautious, I can go full in, and all my players can go full in, and then we all also have the systems in place that if oh hey, we need to stop this roller coaster for a hot second, we have that right there, and it doesn't take away from the experience. It's incredibly freeing to have your limitations and guidelines set in place. It's the same way that with any, take bungee jumping, for example. Only reason you're having fun falling off of a bridge is because you're strapped in, and you have that limitation and guideline there, and that safety there. And then you can go full on to seek that adrenaline, and you're totally fine still. Or as my favorite thing, my favorite example is a trapeze act. You want to have that thrill of seeing the person let go and soar through the air, and you wonder if they're going to make it. But my God, I'd rather have the safety net underneath that in case something fucks up, there's something keeping them safe, and I don't have to clean a mess afterwards.
Yep.
So we only have a few more minutes left. And somebody asked what I think is a great finishing question, which is, what resources do you use at your table? So let's just go around and each person kind of answer their favorite resources. So it doesn't, we're not always going to use the same exact resources at every session. So I want to kind of put that out there first, is, we already talked about how different groups require different resources. So that's always true, but what are your favorites? So we'll start with Steffi.
So the ones that I use a lot, I think I actually, for my PDFs, I link a lot to Kienna's resources, because I like the lines and the fails, and I like the X card. But mostly what I try to use I don't know if it always succeed, but my favorite tool, the one that I try to use most, is indeed encouraging my players. Like, first and foremost, I'm your friend and I want you to be okay. So it's perfectly fine to pause the game. I think that is probably the strongest tool in my arsenal, to just hopefully create an environment where my players feel okay to use the X card that I've then given them.
Okay. Kienna, I mean, you've written a bunch, so
Yeah. So not to toot my own horn, but also I saw people otherwise talking about this. I am the co-creator of the TTRPG Safety Toolkit, which again is a resource that pulls together a whole bunch of safety tools and support tools across the community into one place so that people can refer to it and find the right tools for them and how they can implement it. So it's constantly evolving. It's a living documentation. Google Drive right now, we're moving to a website at some point, but it's a whole bunch of, there's a quick reference guide there to help you get into a super basics as to what safety tools are, and some varieties such as X and O cards, Lines and Veils, Stars and Wishes, the Lauzon technique, all those, as well as copies of other people's work such as John Stefanopoulos's X card document and other awesome stuff there. So that's a really good starting point. It's not the end point, but it's a really great resource for people to learn about what's out there and what could be useful for them to use at their tables.
Right. Corrine?
I would say that I'm a big fan and often use the consent checklist as like the first step. But during game, I think the ones that I use the most, or would encourage my players to use the most with me, would be the X card for anything that you absolutely do not want to proceed with. But also just the idea of we can pause at any time. I will say that basically at the start of every game, of if you are uncomfortable at any point, ask to take a break. Just say you're going to take a break. You can walk away from your camera, for instance, because most of the things I do is streamed. Like, just let me know. And I say it before every single game to make sure that it's front and center, that if you're ever uncomfortable, you are coming first, the player, not the game.
Right. Jax?
So I really like Kienna's toolkit. I haven't read most of it, which is terrible of me, but I know a lot of the things that are in it. I've used Lines and Veils. I've also, for my games, added roads because I've seen Roses and Thorns, which I think is very cool. But I liked adding sort of the idea of here's the things I really want in game to Lines and Veils, because I love Lines and Veils. It's a good solid tool. I really like the X and O cards. I've seen people use the VCR, rewind, pause, fast forward. I haven't used that yet, but I really want to at some point. And finally, because I do a lot of LARPs, I really like the OK check-in because it allows people to proactively ask if you're okay. Which is you hold up an OK sign, always right side up, never like this, because bad people do this. And either I'm okay, I'm not sure, I'm not okay. And anything other than a thumbs up is treated as a, hey, let's pause and talk about this. And that is probably one of my favorite quick tools to use. So
yeah, you can use that tool at a table too. Just saying. We're out of time, but somebody did ask about debriefing, and we didn't really touch on it very much. So I'm just going to quickly say that, when you talk about debriefing, or whether or not you're going to debrief, or what kind of questions you ask on debrief, how to do debriefing, I see a lot of tables that will do debriefs together. Which is great because it allows players to kind of say things in the moment of like, this is what I liked. So always ask them, what did you like? What could we improve upon? What did you hate? And it's okay if the answers are, I didn't like anything, or I don't think anything could be improved upon, or I didn't hate anything. But often people will think of like, oh man, I love this one thing, or, oh, I wasn't really comfortable with this thing. The other thing is to be aware that, or open yourself up to debriefing individually with with the members who may not feel comfortable expressing a problem, especially if the problem isn't with you as a GM, but with another player's actions. So I think the best way to debrief is to really like work with your group and open yourself up to individual debriefs to allow your players to kind of, talk about things that might have happened that they didn't feel comfortable talking about in front of the group. We could do a whole panel on how to debrief properly. So
Sure can.
All right, be back here next week.
Right.
I'm ready.
Save it till next year.
Yeah, but we're out of time.
Potentially.
Yeah, so we're out of time, unfortunately. So thank you all for coming, and I hope that you'll use these safety mechanics, and you'll consider using these at your tables, not just at a convention game, but at your home, game where we play with everybody that you think you know them really well, but sometimes you may not know. You may not know. You don't know what you don't know. So
That's
use the
true.
safety mechanics. So
That's
all
very
right,
Johari.
thank you.
when-
All right. Thank you, everybody,
Bye,
and have a good evening.
Be safe.
We're going to